that this is a war which could affect us all. And the only way that we are going to prevent the worst case is by gearing up and mobilizing for the worst case to deter Russia, but also to give Ukraine the means to achieve victory. If the green button is pressed now to increase defense spending, to look at defense differently, to make sacrifices elsewhere, we're not seeing the political will from our leaders. We're not seeing the moral courage from our leaders. We're not seeing that recognition of the threat to not just Ukraine, but to the UK, to all of NATO.
Hello, I'm Jenny Klochko, and you are watching my podcast. Today in central London, I meet General Sir Richard Shirreff, former Deputy Supreme Allied Commander Europe. We're going to discuss NATO. Hello, how are you today?
Jenny, I'm fine, and it's great to be here.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for finding time and being here. And I hope you will have enough energy to answer all our questions about NATO, because it's one of the most complex and hot topics today. For both sides on the Ukrainian border, for the NATO members and for Ukraine. NATO summit coming in July, and Ukraine is waiting for the invitation. What are your thoughts?
I think it's a really important summit. It's the 75th anniversary of the foundation of NATO. And it comes at a really pivotal time for Ukraine and more widely for European and transatlantic security. So if you're asking what I would like to see out of the summit, I would love to see a clear statement of NATO's strategy focused on achieving a Europe whole, free, and secure, which is capable of deterring Russia and which includes Ukraine as a NATO member. And the means by which that can be achieved, in fact, the only means I believe which will achieve that end, is Ukrainian victory over Russia in Ukraine. In other words, defeat of Russia in Ukraine. Because only with a resounding defeat of Russia, I believe, will Ukraine be ultimately free and independent and secure.
NATO chief Jens Stoltenberg recently urged a speedy military aid for Ukraine and claimed that Ukraine can win the war. But we both know it's very tough on the battlefield right now. And last year, expectations for counteroffensive were a bit disappointed because there was lots of speculation and in media, but it hasn't worked out. So do you share the optimism that Ukraine still can win this war?
I completely believe Ukraine can win the war, but it will only happen if the strategy that I've just outlined is put in place. Thus far, there has been no proper NATO strategy. Thus far, support for Ukraine has been on a bilateral basis. Now, I don't want to underestimate the amount of support that has been given to Ukraine. It was the support led largely by Britain at the start, which gave Ukraine in many ways the means to achieve victory over the Russians in the battle for Kiev, for example. And of course, that would never have happened without that extraordinary courage, determination, and Ukrainian will. But it's not enough to give Ukraine the means to defend itself. We, the West, NATO, has to give Ukraine the means to defeat Russia. And if things go on as they are, that is not going to happen.
It's interesting because you are Army General, you are very experienced, and I would like to hear what you think, because quite often from journalists and sometimes from servicemen, I hear that Ukraine was given just enough to defend, but not enough to win. Would you agree on that?
I would completely agree on that. And then moreover, what I would also highlight is that in many cases, Ukraine has been given capabilities, particularly by America and Germany, but they've been told, you can't use this to attack Russians in Russia. Well, that is not how you fight and win a war. You cannot fight a war, forgive me, with your hands tied behind your back. To achieve victory, Ukraine has to be given a completely different... The critical thing right now is time. Russia is on the move. Russia is advancing slowly, remorselessly, relentlessly, at great cost to Russia. But there's no question that Ukraine is really fighting hard to slow Russia down. And we'll have a really tough fight this year. What is needed is time. That's the most immediate thing. We have to give Ukraine the time to rebuild its armed forces, to recruit more people for its armies and its air force, to build up its military capability, to reconstitute its military formations, and to defend itself, to defend its cities. So it needs air defense as well. But I come back to this point that it's not enough to give Ukraine the means just to defend itself. It has to have the means to achieve victory. Now, that requires a fundamental mindset in NATO and in the West. It means the mobilization of defense industries for war. It means mobilizing our societies. It means building up our own capabilities. It means providing long-term, ensuring there are long-term contracts for production of ammunition and other equipment, for example. And that requires a different mindset. And that is only going to happen, I believe, if there is a change of strategy in NATO, which is coming back to where we started, which is why this summit in July is so important.
Do you see the signs that they work on strategy or their capabilities or even the will? You know, sometimes we have issue with the leadership and the wrong people at on the important seats, let's put it like that, and sometimes they don't do what they're supposed to do.
What I hear is fine talk, but it's deeds that matter, not talk. I mean, I'll give you a good example. President Macron of France, very punchy interview recently in The Economist. I mean, he's saying all the right things, and he's showing a degree of leadership which, frankly, is absent from other European political leaders. But is that being translated into the means? Strategy, military strategy, is about integrating the means, i.e. the resources, with the ways, the how you do it to achieve the ends. So you've got to have the means. I look at this country. I hear Rishi Sunak, for example, talking about give Ukraine the means, get the tools to do the job, and they will win. Are we really giving Ukraine the tools to do the job? I think not. Where are the multi-year contracts being let with industry? Where is the build-up of defense capability? Where is the money going into defense? In this country, it's not happening. We've had a statement that defense spending will rise to 2.5% of GDP by 2030. I mean, that's not good enough. It should have been 2.5% 10 years ago after the invasion of Ukraine. Let's not forget, and I don't need to tell you this, but this war started in March 2014. It's been going on for 10 years now, not just since February the 24th, 2022.
Do you think this attitude, because again, a problem with leadership, or because the war is somewhere there?
Well, I think it's ultimately about leadership. But leadership, political leaders clearly, they have to respond to the electorate, but they have to lead the electorate. They have to explain to the electorate the very real risks in terms of defense and security that not just Ukraine is facing, but the whole of Europe and indeed more broadly North America, the transatlantic region. This is a war not just against Ukraine, it's a war against the West, it's a war against Ukraine joining the West. And we have to recognize that this is existential for European security.
Antony Blinken, during his meeting with Ukraine's foreign minister Kuleba in Belgium, says Ukraine will become NATO member, and quote, "The summit will help to build a bridge to the membership and to create a clear platform for Ukraine moving forward." What does that mean? Could you explain it?
Well, I wish we could have clear statements from the White House. I guess what that means is the summit will lay out a pathway. That is optimistic. I hope it does, but it's got to be a clear pathway. We had high hopes for the Vilnius summit last year. I was in Kiev just before that, talking to create the conditions for a satisfactory outcome of the summit. It was a disappointment. It was more talk, not enough action. So unless we get a clear statement, and there's got to be a pathway, and by pathway, I think there's got to be a clear strategy to a desired set of circumstances, which is Ukraine membership. Now, I don't believe, and the other factor is we have to recognize that NATO is not united on this. I don't believe that, for example, Hungary and Slovakia, are they going to sign up to Ukraine membership of NATO? I think we have to ask some pretty tough questions on that. Is the White House 100% behind Ukrainian membership of NATO? I'm not sure it is right now. Germany, I'm not sure Germany is. I think UK and France, yes, two major NATO nations which are behind Ukrainian membership. But there's the issue with NATO, of course. NATO is a consensus organization. NATO will only agree to a course of action if all 32 member states of NATO sign up to it and agree. All of them. You can't, if Iceland or if Luxembourg says no, then it's not going to happen. And that takes time. So it has to move at the speed of the slowest ship in the convoy. Optimistically, I am optimistic about NATO. It takes time to get there, but usually it gets to the right place. My concern is that there isn't time.
But why is countries like US can hesitate about Ukraine's NATO membership? If Ukraine falls, these armed forces will be used against NATO. You know how many armies were used under occupation to fight the right side of the war. I mean, it's a dangerous, place, because right now, for example, people from the occupied territories like Donetsk and Luhansk, those men, they employed into Russian army, and they used as a cannon foders. So that's the same going to be if Ukraine falls, because right now Ukraine holds it for the whole Europe.
Jenny, I could not agree more. And I've said again and again, and one of the reasons I wrote that book was because in 2014, 2015, I could see the very real danger that Putin was going to cause, not just for Ukraine, for the Baltic states, and the very real potential of a war with Russia. What can I say? Yes, I agree, 100%. And let's be clear, if there is any form of deal, if President Trump gets into the White House as a result of the election this year, he has broadcast that he will do a deal and end the war in 24 hours. Now, my sense is that Ukraine is not going to give up fighting, whatever Trump says, because all my Ukrainian friends say that they know that if they stop fighting, Ukraine will cease to exist. They know that Russia is determined to eliminate and obliterate Ukraine from the map as a sovereign country. Yeah. Any form of deal announced by Putin, by Trump, will just give Putin the excuse to declare victory. And he will rebuild, reset, regain, reconstitute his armed forces, and he will have another go at removing Ukraine from the map as a sovereign country. He will never give up. And that, as you say, will bring Russia to the boundary of the border of NATO. And it is, and emboldened by success in Ukraine, with Ukrainian resources at his disposal, I fear very much that he will then continue, maybe for the Baltic states as well, which, as we all know, were against their will annexed and part of the Soviet Union. Yeah. But Russia believes that they belong to Russia. So how do we get that across? I think we have to continue talking, we have to continue explaining, and we have to continue the message that American security is absolutely 100% bound up in European security. America cannot go back to any form of isolation, as it did in the 1920s. Look what happened then as a result of that. And America and the White House should be 100% committed to Ukrainian victory. My worry at the moment is that I think that in many ways, I think that President Biden is terrified of escalation, is terrified of provoking Russia. My experience and reading of history tells me that Russia only respects strength, that where Russia finds weakness, it will continue to probe, continue to take advantage. And I fear that anything less than a clear and determined statement of Ukrainian victory will be interpreted by Russia as weakness.
In your book, you wrote, quote, "Naïve promise in 2008 to Ukraine to become NATO member." I guess you don't think it like that, or it still was naively to promise Ukraine membership back then, and irrelevant idea to invite Ukraine to protect from Russia in the future, as Ukraine large and Ukraine distant country for UK and US.
It was a naive promise. It was naive to make a promise without backing it up. If NATO is going to make a promise to Ukraine for NATO membership, which it did at the Bucharest summit, it has to be able to back it up. Bringing Ukraine into NATO in 2008 would have meant NATO putting boots on the ground in Ukraine, putting troops in Ukraine, putting aircraft into Ukraine to patrol Ukrainian skies to support Ukraine. In 2008, I think NATO's focus was exclusively on Afghanistan. So that was a naive promise. It was a naive promise. Now, I happen to believe Ukraine must absolutely become part of the NATO alliance. And my point about that sense of, there I'm paraphrasing what Chamberlain said of Czechoslovakia in 1938, a faraway country of which people know little. And that, in 2008, was the attitude for many people. If you stop many people in the high street in High Holborn, outside this building now, they would probably say much the same sort of thing about Ukraine. It's a war that's a long way away. It doesn't affect us. Where is that sense that this is a war against, as I said, against the West? You talk to anybody on the London Tube, no, they're going about their business. They're watching their football teams at the weekend. Life goes on. This isn't a war which is affecting. And we need to try and explain that this is a war which could affect us all. And the only way that we are going to prevent the worst case is by gearing up and mobilizing for the worst case to deter Russia, but also to give Ukraine the means to achieve victory.
Your thoughts on President Obama and his geopolitical decisions, his approach of defending Europe?
Well, I think it's wider in a sense than President Obama. Clearly what Putin has done is, Putin is a blood-stained autocrat who has committed the most unimaginable crimes against Ukraine on a par, frankly, with Nazi Germany's crimes in between 1939 and 45. But coming back to my point about weakness, the West has sent consistently a signal of weakness. I would highlight, as you say, Obama's decision to remove large quantities of American troops from Europe, the so-called pivot to Asia and the Asia-Pacific. But I think it's also the Europeans as well. I would highlight the cumulative removal of European warfighting capabilities from European NATO armies. The British Army is as bad as everybody. The British Army has given up its warfighting capability in many ways. I would highlight Trump's contempt of NATO allies during his time. I think of Cameron's defense review of 2010 when he said there is no existential threat to these islands. This is like the 1930s. There are real parallels between what's happening now and what happened in the 1930s with weak Western democracies, not economically weak, but politically and militarily weak, sending a signal of weakness which bloody autocrats like Putin have taken advantage of.
There's a saying, good times gives weak leaders and hard times give strong leaders, I think, something like that. Maybe our times were too good, too prosperous, too relaxing if we don't have enough strong political leaders.
And I'd also add, Europe has, again, Europe has been completely dependent on America. Europe has sat back and cut its defense spending and expected America to pick up the baton and look after Europe. And that's not good enough, which is one of the reasons, of course, America is increasingly isolationist. I hold no candle for Trump. I think he's absolutely grotesque. But the one thing he has said, which was right, which is that Europe should pick up the bill and be prepared to pay for more for defense. And then to your point about leadership, the other phrase I would just conjure up is cometh the hour, cometh the man or woman. Now is the time that we're looking for the man or woman to step up as a leader. Now, there are leaders in Europe. I would highlight the Prime Minister of Estonia. She's a great leader. She says all the right things, and Estonia is backing it up as well. But there are precious few like her.
When I talk to the servicemen in Ukraine about NATO, and those servicemen who are on the front line, and they express their frustration for NATO, for UN, and they joke about this organization. They call them the organizations of concerned nations, because all Ukraine gets is like being concerned. They are so concerned, and so Ukraine deal with your war yourself, basically. How would you reply on that?
I would say they have every reason to say that. I mean, it goes back to my parent. I mean, I listen to the Daily Telegraph podcast on Ukraine. I don't read the Daily Telegraph, I hasten to add, but I do think it's a very good podcast.
No, they do a great job.
But every time I hear it's that opening line from Rishi Sunak, give Ukraine the tools to do the job, and then he says Slava Ukraini, but in a very sort of South London accent, I think to myself, come on, these are platitudes. These don't mean anything. And that is exactly what Ukrainian soldiers, that's why they're saying the Organization of Concerned States. That's why I say NATO has to change strategy, has to adopt an approach that says defeat Ukraine.
You worked on the very top in NATO. Do you see the potential for that?
I go back to my point earlier. I do, but NATO takes time. And the only... I mean, this is a tragedy that we don't have time, and only when people in the West are really frightened will they change. In my view, I'm afraid that this is really pessimistic stuff, but will they be prepared to put the money and resources into defence that's needed? I mean, yet again, this morning I hear Foreign Secretary Cameron berating other NATO nations to raise their defence spending. Where was he in 2014?
I have a question about him. Because he was the Prime Minister.
He was the Prime Minister.
Foreign Secretary, and his first official visit was for Ukraine. And again, in Ukraine, it's a good PR place.
It's good PR. It looks good. And yes, Britain is continuing to give, whatever it is, $2 billion a year earmarked from the... That's not inconsiderable. But it's not enough. It is that recognition that we have to gear up for the worst case. We have to be prepared to fight Russia as an alliance. And as well as being prepared to fight Russia as an alliance, we have to give Ukraine the means to fight and win. And the only way that will happen is if there is a fundamental shift, if the green button is pressed now to increase defense spending, to look at defense differently, to make sacrifices elsewhere. And I'm afraid I don't get any sense of that from either of the two main parties. I mean, I think Labour have some good ideas on defence. But I've yet to hear Keir Starmer say, for example, that defeat of Russia in Ukraine and an increase in and effective increase in defence spending to prepare Britain for war is one of his top priorities. It's not there.
I've got a question for you from Ukrainian servicemen. I don't know what's direction or what part of the front line. I wasn't told. But these people go on the tasks on a daily basis. And the question for you, because I asked him, it's like, what would you ask a British general? And the question is, why the UK is not building factories for production of ammunition abroad for Ukraine?
It's a really good question. I wish I could answer it. And I can answer it. And in the sense I've said it already, we're not seeing the political will from our leaders. We're not seeing the moral courage from our leaders. We're not seeing that recognition of the threat to not just Ukraine, but to UK, to all of NATO from our leaders. And this is exactly what I've been saying this for 2 years, that we should be building more factories for increasing ammunition production, increasing production of equipment, increasing defense budgets. So to your Ukrainian servicemen, I would say, thank you for what you're doing. I absolutely salute, have the greatest respect for what you're doing. But I will continue to shout as loudly as I can from the rooftops about the need to do exactly what he's saying, to increase ammunition production in order to get it to Ukraine.
This leads to the next question from the British officer who went through Iraq and Afghanistan. And the question is, how the UK government, Labour, Conservatives, should convince the voting public to agree a huge rise in defence spending?
And it's the same answer. How do you persuade? You have to explain. We need leaders who can explain the problem, explain the real threat, explain the reason why. And we haven't got that because we have leaders who think short term and are not prepared to risk being unpopular. They believe they've got to try and maintain popularity by giving people what they want rather than what they need. So these are all political questions, ultimately.
Maybe because the politicians don't feel threatened by Russia, maybe for them the war as well somewhere there. Because when the missile landing on your home, your way of thinking changing dramatically within a second, isn't it?
Yeah, of course. And they reflect 90% of the British people who don't feel threatened.
It's good for them because it's quite heavy feeling to be not able to plan your next day, not having sleep at night. And one of the guests on this podcast, she's the most famous painter in Ukraine. And I asked her, what would you like after the war, the victory? And she's like, to like windows again. Because now all the windows, you can't sleep by the windows because it's a threat. If there's explosion, you're going to be injured, all the parts. And all of those things Russia took away from Ukrainian people. While British people or British politicians do not feel that way, you can't really explain them, can you?
No, you can't. And it's this, again, it's very difficult to sort of, we go round in circles here.
Yeah.
That this is, again, I think people have to recognise that expenditure now on defence, increase in defence spending, giving Ukraine the means to do the job, is the way to avoid the catastrophe of a third world war. And I really believe that spectre is out there of a war between Russia and NATO. And if Ukraine is not given what it needs to defeat Russia, if the strategy of only giving enough to defend it continues, if there is a deal done by a President Trump who says he's going to do a deal, that will absolutely lead to Europe having to fight, the NATO nations having to fight Russia. I believe that within 5, within 7 years, within 10 years or something. Well, can you imagine the costs of that in terms of not just treasure, but blood, and the catastrophe that would be, whereas we could stop it by being strong now?
In my opinion, we could stop Putin in 2014 because I think Crimea was a test for the West, and that test, the West failed. So that's why there was invasion in the East, and Putin does whatever he likes with Ukraine. Being quite often in Ukraine and coming back here, I can't. Sometimes it's more often, sometimes it's less. Walking in the street or being in public transport, I look at the young man and thinking, my God, he's enjoying his life. But I lost already friends. I lost colleagues who stopped being journalists and joined army, and they are not with us anymore. Those people gave their life. I don't want war to come to London. Here's my home, here's my child goes to school, my husband. I don't want war to be here. But these attributes of peaceful life, public transport, buses, people sitting relaxed in the pubs outside, it's something very exotic, especially when you come not just from Ukraine, from more or less peaceful look like Kiev, but I mean from Donetsk region or from Kharkiv. When I went there, and people don't have even air raids there because the missiles take 30 seconds to cross the border and hit the target in Kharkiv. People in Kharkiv don't have this luxury, and after being there, it does feel surreal.
Jenny, what can I say except that it comes back to It comes back to be ready for the worst case. It comes back to deterring Russia, and it comes back to giving Ukraine the means to defeat Russia. The reality is that this is not Putin's war. This is Russia's war. That deep, I think, in the Russian DNA is that sense that Ukraine has no right to exist as a nation. That is old-style, imperial Russian, Tsarist, Soviet thinking. The only way that Europe and the transatlantic region is going to be able to enjoy peace and security for the next 50 years, maybe longer, is by putting in place a band of deterrent steel around Eastern Europe to include Ukraine. The Second World War went on for 6 years. I think we need to be prepared for the same length of time.
Валерий Герасимов. Russian army general serving as the chief of general staff and the first deputy of Minister Shoigu. You met him and you welcome him to your home. Is that correct?
It is completely correct.